I now have the honor and the distinct pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker. Hilary Shelton presently serves as the director to the NAACP's Washington Bureau, Senior Vice President for Advocacy and Policy. Prior to the NAACP, he served as Federal Liaison Assistant Director to the Government Affairs Department of the College Fund, United Negro College Fund. And prior to that, Mr. Shelton was the Federal Policy Program Director to the 8.5 million member United Methodist Church's Social Justice Advocacy Agency, the General Board of Church and Society. Playing an integral role in the crafting and final passage of such crucial federal legislation as the Civil Rights Act of 1991, Hilary was also instrumental in ushering through to passage the Civil Rights Restoration Act, the Violence Against Women Act, the Hate Crimes Statistics Act, the Native American Free Exercise of Religion Act, the National Voter Registration Act, the National Assault Weapons Ban, the Brady Handgun Law, reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act, the Help America Vote Act, and many other crucial laws and policy measures affecting the quality of our lives and equality in our society. Mr. Shelton has received a number of awards and recognitions, among them the National NAACP Medgar Evers Award for Excellence, the highest honor bestowed upon a national professional staff member of the NAACP for outstanding service. Mr. Shelton was born in St. Louis, Missouri. He holds degrees in political science, communications, and legal studies from Howard University in D.C., the University of Missouri, and Northeastern University in Boston, respectively. Mr. Shelton lives in Washington, D.C. with his wife, Paula, and their 3 sons. It is my honor to bring to you, ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for our keynote speaker, Mr. Hilary Shelton. Thank you so much, such an honor.
Can you hear me with this one? Good afternoon. Hey, this is a celebration. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Thank you so much. It is a true honor for me to be here with you in Winnetka, and I have pronounced saying it that way. I kept wanting to add an extra syllable. The guy who gave me a ride in said, try to do it with 1 syllable as much as you can, and you might get it right. So I'm honored to be in Winnetka, Illinois with you this afternoon to celebrate and commemorate this wonderful opportunity. First, give yourselves a big hand. First, let me thank Sheila, quite frankly, for having the courage to introduce a brother like me. Indeed, her bringing that forward, the issues that you have, I have to honestly say, as I listened to that overly generous introduction, I was taken back to the story of a woman that had sadly been widowed. She sat on the front pew of her church as friend and colleague, co-worker, and other came by one, all giving great accolades to her recently deceased husband. She was leaning on her son's shoulder, and then finally, as this went on, almost to a point of ad nauseum, she turns to her son and says, son, will you please get up and see what it is in that box that they're talking about? Because Lord knows it ain't your daddy. But with that in mind, I'm honored to be here, and please give Sheila another big hand. As we commemorate on this day and celebrate the 50th anniversary of both Dr. King coming here to help bring forward that vision of equal opportunity and equal protection for all under law, including fair housing. We understood what it was that he was doing then as he brought those great words, and it's for that reason that we celebrate. But in many ways, more importantly, we also commemorate. We commemorate because here we are at a day and time recognizing what was done, but the movement that was fired then is a movement that carries on today. And as I look across this area, and I see all of you have come out as part of this movement, again, please give yourselves another huge hand. He knew then what we understand today. He knows that these changes don't happen overnight. He knows that you have to give at least as much time as we took to create the challenge and the problem, as we do to actually solve the issues and move forward that real vision for an all-inclusive America. So with that, I want to thank you. on behalf of the NAACP, our nation's oldest and largest grassroots-based civil rights organization. We literally have 2,200 membership units throughout the United States. We're in every state in this country, but we're also on military bases still in Italy, Germany, Korea, and Japan, as we move forward in our initiative and that vision of an integrated armed services as well. I'm also happy to be here because some of my leadership has joined us today as well. Now, I don't want to call too many names because they told me in 15 minutes a giant hook would come out, and I'd be pulled out reminiscent of the Gong Show of days gone by. So I'm going to try to adhere to a long-standing NAACP tradition to both begin and end these meetings on the same day. But with that in mind, yeah, you can give that a big hand now. With that in mind, I do want to recognize a few friends. First, our state conference president is here. He's someone that is no stranger to this area. He's all over the state and all over the country, as a matter of fact. I don't know what you realize that you have here in Illinois and how powerful his vision and his insight is. But he's been a true friend and a true leader of the NAACP. I hope you'll give George Mitchell a huge hand. You know, when I came in and saw how well organized we were, I wanted to know where the mastermind was. And so I realized as we talked about open community and programs like this and bringing us together to commemorate and stop for just this moment, just to pause for a second and see what it is that we've gotten done as we look behind us, to see what's going on right now, but also to see how we are in that vision going forward. And I have to say that I was extremely impressed, and I hope you'll give Gail Schechter a huge hand. Trying to keep my list nice and low because I've met a lot of your local politicians, and I commend you for this. You kept them all in check. Everyone I spoke to had a vision and an understanding, quite frankly, of what's going on here today. They understand the values that we show when we have commemorations and meetings like this. But I have to say, one of the things that is under that tent right there is an NAACP booth that actually has the legislative report card that tells you how all of your members of the House and all of your members of the U.S. Senate voted on our bread and butter civil rights agenda. And let me say this, not just because she just walked up and I got a chance to get a big hug and a kiss from her, but because I know what she does for you all day, every day in Washington, D.C. You could not have selected a better member of Congress. I hope you'll give your Congresswoman, Jan Schakowsky, a huge hand. I appreciate you. She carries our agenda. There is no one that votes better. Look, it's great that she shows up. She's always here, and she's always in Washington with us as well. It's great they come, and sometimes, you know how some politicians can be. They'll remember your name, they'll remember your spouse's name, your kids, they'll kiss you on the cheek, and they'll go back to Washington and vote away every single promise that they've ever made for you. But let me say this as well. You do not have that here in Winnecta. You got Jan Schakowsky. Thank you so much. So as we move through, we know that there's so much that we still must do. We know that as we think about the issues of fair housing has been central to the challenges and concerns that Dr. King came here to talk about. It is housing that determines very well whether you will have resources to retire at the end of life. That real wealth that's developed for most Americans is done through home ownership. You also know that as we think about the concerns here, is housing determines where your kids go to school, how secure you are, how your neighborhood will work. It is where you live and where you're able to live that makes so many decisions for us economically and socially. So to talk about issues, we know that as much as we've come so far along this way, there's so much that still needs to be done. We know that we're very delighted that we still do things like testing here in Illinois. Now, some people have a problem with testing, but when we're talking about fair housing testing, it's a good idea. It's a good idea because we've seen when we send candidates in applying for either a new apartment or going to the bank to take out a loan. We know that too often redlining and steering, though they want to call it something different, it still works and acts the same way. So we're delighted that we still have those that are driving those initiatives forward. I have to say, as I came here to talk to you, as you celebrate and talk about what has to be done on the ground, we just had Julian Castro at the NAACP National Convention. He's our new Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, and he's carrying forward on issues that are so important to us. We're delighted that that agency is led the way that it is, because it's under Castro that he's talked about the NAACP's agenda on testing. It is under Julian Castro that we talked about disparate impact to determine whether someone is being discriminated against. There are those that would argue that unless you can show intent, in other words, unless you're a mind reader, or someone was stupid enough to put it in a memo and allow that memo to get out, then it ain't discrimination. We know there's something really wrong with that, because it's the impact that makes all the difference. And that's why we're delighted that we were able to win the Supreme Court decision, and indeed, disparate impact is the law of the land. The issue of affirmatively furthering fair housing. Now there's a tongue twister for you. Affirmatively furthering fair housing says that, in essence, we have to be deliberate about making sure that everyone's being treated fairly. We have to be deliberate in making sure steering doesn't go on. We have to be deliberate in making sure that predatory lending is not the cause celeb or how we do business. We have to make sure that those things are done. And that's why also we were delighted that just 2 years ago, Sean Donovan, who was the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, came to the NAACP convention to announce something we've been working on for much longer than that. He wanted to make sure that we make it very affirming. We move forward in addressing issues of housing discrimination, and that indeed we will move forward to put those policies in place. Those policies were challenged right after he announced them. We're not surprised about that. But indeed, what did happen in the final analysis is, as we moved from Sean Donovan to Julian Castro, that we carried forward and we won that issue as well. Affirmatively furthering fair housing is the law of the land. But it's not just there. We know that as we're making some of these strides forward, that there are those that would move to hold us back. There were those that would even use something as sacred to the democracy as the vote to stop us from fully participating. We know about those tricks that are played and how innocuous it sounds when we say that everyone has to have a photo ID. Now, most people say, well, doesn't everybody have a photo ID because doesn't everybody drive? Well, isn't that the same mistake we made in New Orleans with Hurricane Katrina? Isn't that the mistake that we made as we saw that hurricane jumping over the Florida Peninsula and making its way around the Gulf Coast, making a beeline straight for New Orleans? And as the mayor, who just happened to be African American, by the way, got on all the TV stations and everything else, said, everybody, the hurricane is coming. Jump in your cars and drive north. Well, here's the hard lesson we learned. The hard lesson we learned is over 52% of New Orleans population doesn't own cars. And as such, they don't have driver's license. And as simple as it sounded, to hop in your car and drive north, we saw the tens of thousands that were sitting in the Superdome. We saw the tens of thousands that were in the convention center in the city of New Orleans that couldn't get out. And sadly, we saw what happens when they're not truly thinking about the condition our condition's in. So with that in mind, we want to make sure that as we're moving forward, that these things are like simple fixes, are fixes that in many ways end up locking us out of the system that we're trying to get to work in the first place. Because here in the state of Illinois, we know that over 700,000 Illinoisans do not have the prerequisite ID you would need to be able to vote under these photo ID systems. And we know as much they might tell you that we'll make photo IDs free to anybody that wants them. Let me tell you, in your neighboring state of Iowa, when they did that, we talked to some retired white Americans that had moved into Iowa because that was back home for them. And as they went to the polling place, or they went to the DMC to actually get their free photo IDs, they ended up sitting for 5 hours to be able to get that so-called free ID. If you weren't looking for a tool or a manner to turn people away from the polls, that was clearly it. In essence, we know that sometimes this stuff sounds like an easy fix, but the reality of the conditions that our people are living in oftentimes doesn't make it quite easy. So we want to make sure a couple of things happen. Number one is we have to fix the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Supreme Court, and another one of those ridiculous 5-4 extremist versus the conservative decisions, actually came out and said that for some reason, Section 5 won't be utilized anymore. In essence, we're not going to mess with Section 5 because we're going to take this roundabout approach and eliminate the tool that actually decides what goes under Section 4 and Section 5. In other words, if Section 5 were the car that you would drive forward to prevent discrimination and make sure everyone at the front end is able to vote, Section 4B would be the gasoline you put in the car. In essence, it don't drive without the gas. Section 4B says Section 4B was outdated and shouldn't be in place anymore. But we knew what the deal was. We knew after 21 hearings on Capitol Hill, we knew that those hearings in the House and the Senate and over 17,000 pages of testimony. If you're trying to suggest to me that it wasn't properly looked at, if indeed we didn't take a good assessment and analysis of the Voting Rights Act before we actually renewed it in 2006, then you've missed the point. But so did 5 members of the U.S. Supreme Court. So in essence, as we move forward, we need to now pass a new piece of legislation. A piece of legislation called the Voting Rights Advancement Act that is now pending before the House and Senate. The Voting Rights Advancement Act, and I didn't want to take a thunder, but let me also say I can tell you that one of my original sponsors on that just happens to be Jan Schakowsky. So let me say this as I go to move from this. We know that we need to hold our legislators accountable. And that's why, again, I'm happy to have Jan here. Because if you look at something that the NAACP is doing since 1914, yes, we've had the audacity to actually collect data on those most powerful voting members of the House and Senate. Since 1914, we've graded the 435 members of the House and the 100 voting members of the Senate on how they vote on the bread and butter civil rights agenda of the NAACP. And let me say, if you'd like to get a copy of that, as we do it now, I do have the pleasure of doing that report card. You can go right over here to that same tent, and they'll give you the Illinois report card that'll show you how everyone voted. And let me say again, your congressperson makes me proud. So brothers and sisters, the march continues here. The march continues as we know our movement has to go forward. The march continues right here in this city. The march continues as we move forward to see to it that fair housing completely becomes the law of the land. That everyone, regardless of their background, their race, their ethnicity, their point of national origin, can live wherever their resources will take them. And we work also to make sure resources don't become that discriminatory tool. But we got to continue to march, because every fix that I've shared with you is a fix that's now pending before a Congress that doesn't seem to want to make it happen. And that's why, beginning on August 1st, we're going to begin in Selma, Alabama, the place where the voting rights struggle pinnacled. We're going to march from Selma, Alabama to Atlanta, Georgia. From Atlanta, Georgia, we're going to go to Charleston, South Carolina. From Charleston, South Carolina to Charlotte, North Carolina. From Charlotte, North Carolina to Richmond, Virginia. And from Richmond, Virginia, we're going to end up on the steps of the Capitol on September 16th, where we're going to spread out and we're going to hit every office, every nook and cranny on Capitol Hill, and make sure every single piece of legislation we discuss becomes the law of the land and the promises of the Constitution are met. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for what you do, and thank you for the fight we'll have beginning tomorrow morning. Thank you very much.